Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leanne Hackman-Carty, and it looks like we have all our speakers on the line now, so we're going to get started. Thanks for joining in again this week for our COVID webinar. As those of you who have been coming in every week know, we've changed we've shifted our webinars slightly over the last little bit and are looking more opportunities for the future post-COVID. Where are we going? Where are some of the areas that Alberta economic developers could look and elected officials as far as opportunities to recover and become more resilient? So we're going to be taping the webinar today, and it'll be available for download later. So if you want to share it with anyone that you think would be helpful, feel free to do so. As far as if there's questions that you have as we go, please just put them in the chat box below wherever it is on your computer. But Nancy, my colleague, is going to be curating those questions, and we'll have time at the end, hopefully. Today we actually have 3 speakers, but before they get started, I'm going to introduce Tanya Thorne. Tanya is actually a counselor for the city of Okotoks, and she's very involved with the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, and they're actually a partner on these webinars. So I'm going to turn it over to Tanya to say a few words on behalf of AUMA and also introduce our speakers today. So Tanya?
Hello, can we hear me? Yes? Okay, good. So you never know if technology is going to be there and be your friend for the day. So thanks very much, Leanne. My name is Tanya Thorne. And as Leanne indicated, I'm a town councillor with the town of Okotoks, but I also serve on the AUMA's board of directors, and I'm the vice president of towns with AUMA. And as always, AUMA is very proud to be the sponsor of this series of webinars with economic developers of Alberta. We really appreciate the partnership and collaboration that we've had going on there. AUMA is an organization. We basically represent all the urban municipalities, so cities, towns, villages, summer villages, and specialized municipalities across the province. And I'm really excited to introduce today's topic on Alberta utilities. It's been something that we've been an advocate of a variety of different issues over the course of time on this, whether that's disparity around transmission and distribution rates across the province. Certainly been lobbying the federal government for, I think, as long as I've been a councillor, which is back to 2013, on broadband issues. And COVID-19 certainly has introduced why broadband is so important, in that, we'd never know what could face us, and having access to the internet is, it's a lifeline out there. So that's been a big one for that. So today I'd like to get us started here. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I apologize in advance to any of you if I get your last names wrong. But first up, we have Marc Closer. He's the chair of Alberta Utilities Commission. So welcome, Marc. And next is Todd Detling, who's the VP of Customer Service with Fortis Alberta. And then wrapping up our speakers is Peter Casarella. He's the executive director with the South Grow Regional Initiative, which is a broadband initiative. So I'm going to turn it back to Leanne. Thank you again for having AUMA as part of this, and she'll get us started.
Thanks very much, Tanya, and thanks for your ongoing support. You've been a supporter of EDA for a very long time, so thank you. So we will get started with Marc Closer. He's the chair of the Alberta Utilities Commission, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy guy, and to be able to just share some of the work that you guys do. I know for many of our economic developers, when they're promoting business retention, attraction to their communities, utilities is a big issue. What do you have? What are the connectivities, the services? So, Marc, if I just want to turn it over to you, and thank you once again for being here today.
All right, Leanne. Well, I'm very pleased to be able to take some time to join your call. For those of you who are not well acquainted with the Alberta Utilities Commission, just let me give you a bit of background about what we do. And then maybe I'll spend a bit of time talking about what's been going on in the last few months while we've been dealing with what we call the double whammy of the impact of COVID, as well as a significant reduction in oil prices. So let me start by just giving a very high-level overview of what the AUC does. So we are the utility regulator for non-federally regulated utilities in Alberta. So we regulate gas and electric distribution and some gas transmission, all the electric transmission. So we approve on the transmission side all the transmission facilities that are built. They all have to be approved by us with respect to where they get put, as well as the cost of any transmission that's built. It all has to be approved by us, and then of course all those costs go into the rates that we all pay. We also regulate distribution. So at the distribution level, we are the rate regulator. All the distribution rates in Alberta on both the gas and the electric side are regulated under performance-based regulation. So just very high level, what that means is the actual rates that you pay for transmission, they are price capped. So the rate changes you see from one year to the next are a function of a formula that restricts the amount that those rates can go up based on the expectation of productivity gains that the distribution utility is expected to be able to make, and whatever the rate of inflation is. So all of the distribution rates are essentially capped. On the transmission side, it's a little more complicated, but we have to approve all of the costs for transmission that go into rates, and then we approve all the transmission rates. The majority of that just basically shows up on your bill as one transmission charge, which is essentially managed by the Alberta Electric System Operator. We actually have a very complex utility structure here. And even from a regulatory perspective, we have a very complex utility structure. There's only one other jurisdiction in North America that looks anything like us, and that is the state of Texas. So we have both regulated and retail delivery of both gas and electric. And we have a competitive electricity market. So the actual supply, the actual generation side is a competitive market. There's a very complex bidding structure that's in place, managed by the Alberta Electric System Operator. And the role that we play in all of that is we approve all of the rules by which the competitive generation market works, and the market surveillance administrator, which is a separate provincial, we'll say, regulator. It's really an agency. They essentially monitor the activity in the competitive market. To the extent that they note that there may be activity in the market that is offside, that comes back to us at the AUC, and we have to adjudicate as to whether or not there's been any anti-competitive behavior. We do not regulate rural electrification. So if you're on an REA, their rates are set totally independent of us. We only get involved with REAs in response to a dispute. If there's a dispute, it generally comes to us. We don't regulate water in Alberta, with the exception of if there is a dispute that can be brought to us, and we will deal with that if it is brought to us. But so that's I'm talking a very high level overview of what we actually do. So let me just turn to what's been going on in the last few months. So as you know, there's been a significant economic shutdown due to COVID, and that's been coupled with oil prices that have been at levels well below what the Alberta domestic production costs are. And that's really resulted in a huge economic impact. I am very pleased to say, though, that the utility industry in Alberta has performed exceptionally well during this time. They've obviously been faced with a lot of the same challenges that probably many people on this call have been faced with. You know, how do you keep the lights on? How do you keep the gas flowing? How do you keep your business going when you've got to deal with the current COVID-related situation? And I can honestly say that I've obviously had a lot of interaction with all of the, at least all of the regulated utilities in Alberta, and to some extent with the REAs as well during this time. And they have really performed exceptionally well. Some interesting things that we've seen happen during this time. While we've seen this significant downturn, what we've also seen is some additional renewable resources coming online during this time, and that's had a bit of an impact. So we've had about 159 megawatts of additional capacity come on during a time when we've seen demand for electricity actually drop. With respect to that, if you look at the same period in 2019, the average load, oddly enough, during the month of March went up a bit by about 0.9%. But then it actually dropped by 2.3% in the month of April. And if you look at that on an apples to apples comparison on a weather normalized basis, what actually happened is demand in April actually dropped by 4% relative to last year. So we've seen a, not a huge drop in demand, but a fairly significant one. However, in the month of May, we saw it drop by an additional 6.5. So we're now at the, in June, starting to see somewhat of an upswing as the economy begins to reopen. It's interesting that we have an unusual load shape, and when we say load, where does the demand for power in Alberta really come from? And as you might not expect, most load primarily comes from rural and industrial demand, which is very different than in a lot of other jurisdictions. And although we've seen a pretty significant economic downturn, most industrial facilities continued to operate. And so that particular subset of demand between March and April, their demand really declined by roughly 10%. So the other, so we've seen a certain amount of downturn. The other interesting thing too is that ordinarily on a weekday, the peak demand for electricity usually happens between 6 and 9, and what we're seeing during the last few months is it's actually, the peak has actually started at 5 as opposed to 6. So there's been a bit of a shift here, and there's been a greater concentration of the amount of consumption. In effect, that peak has gotten bigger at around 6 o'clock than it used to be. And it's probably a function of just the fact that so many people work from home now. That's been somewhat offset by the fact that the actual price of electricity has gone down. So in April and May, it was about $29 per megawatt, and then in May about 26. The average pool price in 2019 was about $56. So there's been a significant reduction in the actual cost of the energy charges that we pay. As we look ahead, we're not sure sort of what the future looks like. We're not sure how long it's going to take for the economy to start to recover. But I know that the provincial government is looking at the potential to take steps to how to deal with any of the potential needs which might occur over the next few months as they turn their minds to what the economic recovery has to look like. And we're certainly currently involved in some discussions with respect to what might have to occur in the utility sector to deal with any support that might have to be brought into play as we think about how we move ahead with the economic recovery. So look, it's about 12:18 now. I've probably been on for longer than I should have, so I'm going to pass it back to Leanne because I know we got a couple of other folks who have to jump in here. So hopefully that was somewhat helpful and informative.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate getting that perspective. I think we'll turn it over then probably to Todd Detling. Todd is the Vice President of Customer Service for Fortis Alberta, and Fortis is actually a relatively new member of EDA and a sponsor of our conference. So Todd, if you want to take it away, that'd be great.
Thanks, Leanne. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I brought along a presentation today, I think, to kind of address some of the questions that were raised in advance of this webinar. So I'll just pull that up if I can here and just walk through a little bit of background about Fortis. Hang on a sec here. Everybody see that? There we go. So obviously, like everyone else, Fortis Alberta continues to work through the impact of the pandemic, and obviously our goal has been to continue to maintain the delivery of a safe and reliable electric system to all our communities across Alberta. I'm going to just give a bit of an overview of who we are and what we serve in Alberta, a little bit around how we've dealt with COVID-19, and then get into some of the things that we really believe are, I guess, supportive to the economic development in Alberta, and things that we will continue to do in our service area, as well as some thoughts on how we can support the recovery in Alberta. So by the PowerPoint, you can see that we serve more than 500,000 residential, farm, and business consumers in Alberta, covering about 225,000 square kilometers. And you see that on the map of our service area. Just to be clear and to continue on with Mark's comments, our role in Alberta in managing our component is we are the poles and wire owner of the distribution system in the map that I have in front of you. So our responsibility is to ensure the customers are connected to the grid, as well as all the metering information is collected through our system and distributed out to the retail community. Who you would be, maybe folks on this call would be familiar with receiving their bill from. We deliver about 17,000 gigawatt hours of electricity each year. And just to give some perspective to that, 1 gigawatt serves about 700,000 homes. So to complement Marc's comment about, you know, high rural industrial demand in Alberta, you can appreciate that a big part of our delivery is to serve the large commercial and commercial customers in Alberta. We operate in about 240 communities in the area that's shown, and have about 125,000 kilometers of power lines in our system. So to just give you an order of magnitude, that if you were to wrap our power lines around the world, you'd get around 3 times to do that. So a fairly significant infrastructure that we have. We employ about 1,100 Albertans directly at Fortis, Alberta, as well as probably an additional 500 contractors that are related to construction, engineering, vegetation control, locate services in Alberta, as well as IT resources. So we've got a fairly significant impact on the ongoing economic ability for Alberta. Obviously, all of us had to deal with the impacts of COVID, and obviously, as the government of Alberta has introduced a staged economic relaunch, we have worked collectively in ensuring that we have maintained our services throughout this pandemic period. Fortis Alberta had no reduction in services to its customers over this term, and we were successful in relocating our staff to remote locations, or their homes, if you will, to the tune of about 75% of our staff. And obviously, with the operations on the lines and the need for our power line technicians to work on that on a day-to-day basis, we split their commuting to their attendance at work at 50% home and 50% at the office, to kind of reduce our improve our physical distancing across our business operations. When I think about what we do in Alberta, obviously reliability is a major component of what we do to ensure that consumers in Alberta receive safe and reliable electricity. And our system is becoming more and more advanced each day. We have a control center that's located in Airdrie, Alberta, and it provides oversight and the direction around the operation of our system to our field staff. We have automated systems in place where we can remotely control up to 1,800 devices across our system in Alberta. So that allows, even before a truck rolls to respond to a power outage, our operators are able to make decisions on how they might be able to restore the power. And in addition to that, across 22 municipalities, our larger municipalities in our service area, we have automation schemes that allow the system to recover electricity if there's a fault in the system, to get more customers on quickly. In addition to that, we also have some predictive models that also help us understand the impact of the system if there's an outage. And through that, we're able to communicate through our online web app. So if consumers are faced with an interruption of power, they could access through our website power outage map and see exactly what's happening on the system in their location. And we work very hard at providing ETRs for the restoration of power. And we find that really helpful for not only residents, but for our commercial operators, and them having a good understanding of when their power is going to be restored. With respect to renewables, we see ourselves as a distribution owner as acting as an enabler for renewable and or alternative energy in Alberta. We are actually currently actively working with the Alberta Electric System Operator and stakeholders to develop a consistent approach of grid connection costs. And that's been a bit of a question mark over the last couple years. And we're very confident that we're going to come out of this discussion with some clarity that will allow some confidence in project financing going forward for those types of projects. We're also very active participants in the Alberta Utility Commission's Distribution System Inquiry, which is seeking to understand the technologies available and where they fit into the future for our customers, which could include electric vehicles or energy storage. And when we look at the grid of the future, we obviously anticipate significant growth in electric transportation, battery storage at the customer level, but potentially at the grid level to support further reliability in our rural operation. As far as investing in Alberta, we have the ability to invest in the construction of distribution infrastructure. We invest in new services or upgraded services in a way that really helps the initial construction costs for customers and developers to remain low. This investment is paid back over time through the specific rate class of similar customers. And for example, when we look at our residential and commercial developers in Alberta, initially when they install the facilities, they provide a construction contribution for that infrastructure. And what we find over the 10-year period where we will refund their initial investment, we find that developers in Alberta are recouping up to 94% of their investment back. So a fairly good play on a developer's part as far as ensuring that they can recover their initial investment on the electric system. As always, though, we encourage developers and municipalities to engage with us early in their electrical requirements for their development. And depending on the type of operation that you may be developing, there may be varying infrastructure that may take, in some cases, weeks or months for the connection. And that's a significant note that we wanted to get out here today, is that to engage us early as we support development in your community. Through a franchise agreement today in Alberta that we have with our urban municipalities, we collect approximately $50 million in revenue annually that's flowed through to the municipality. And not only do we invest in the infrastructure of Alberta, but we're a strong contributor into the community, and we consistently invest up to $1 million annually into supporting charities and within our communities, including STARS, we're a major provide major commitment to that, as well as educating our children around power line safety, where we support an in-classroom program around electric safety to over 4,500 children in our service area. When we think about working together and what developers or officials should be thinking about now, I want to remind everyone on this call that we are a regulated business in Alberta. So any investment changes in our model today would have to be presented and approved by the Alberta Utilities Commission. We obviously see electricity as an enabler for growth and innovation in all sectors, including agricultural, smart cities, and mobility. And when we think about where can communities compete, or how can they compete in our service area, obviously the provision of a reliable electricity service can support the growth in industry. And there's really no limit to the type of business offering in a community that we can support within our service area. And we find that our service provision is very competitive with the two larger municipalities in Alberta. And when we think about rural Alberta and the lower land costs and generally good access to labor and transportation, we believe that rural Alberta has a very competitive edge to attracting business. Obviously, we continue to look for more integration of our technology to ensure consumers are managing their energy needs effectively and efficiently. And we provide that through some web information and app around their account and usage. And that just helps consumers become more knowledgeable about the energy use that they have on the system. Obviously, within the communities, we encourage dialogue with our operations teams to ensure any planning and developments can be coordinated collectively. And we really take a white glove approach to our municipal partners, where each administration in our service area has access to an assigned stakeholder relations manager within Fortis Alberta. And we've been really encouraged, especially over the last couple of years, the economic development models that have been developing within the municipalities, and that communication line that's starting to open up to have early discussions about some of the electricity needs in those communities. Obviously, our philosophy is long-term as a utility service provider, and you can see that in our asset management program, our deployment of technology for reliability, and our goal is to continue to meet the needs of Alberta as we serve. And as an Alberta-based company, we're here to support our communities in this journey to build a new and prosperous economic community. And we look forward to supporting a more diverse, sustainable Alberta.
Just before we take questions, turn it over to Peter Casarella. Peter's the Executive Director at South Grow Regional Alliance and one of our REDAs in the province. And I know that you were going to even talk about this at our conference, and hopefully in November you still will. But really, some of the great work you guys have been doing on the broadband issues. So Peter, take it away.
There we go. Can I share my screen, Leanne?
Should be able to. Just go, yeah.
There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so Leanne asked me to come on here and talk about some of the work we've done on broadband and tie it into the conversation around utilities as well. I've been a personal proponent for a very long time that broadband in Canada should be a utility. And the way that we're going to get ahead and keep up with our competitor nations is if we go in that direction. Now, that's an entirely different conversation with lots of different rabbit holes down it. I just want to give some background about game-changing infrastructure in Canada, some problems that Canada faces as we try to keep up with our competitor nations on the broadband front, and then talk about the work that we've done specifically in Southern Alberta to try to circumvent these problems. So if you like history textbooks and you like economics and you like politics, you'll be aware of some of the game-changing infrastructure advances that the Western and modern developed world has seen over the last couple of centuries. Things like road, rail, telephone, electricity, sewers, water distribution, things that we take for granted at this point in history. But every few decades or so, another one of these things comes along. And the reality is that if you as a community don't get it and incorporate a new game-changing infrastructure into your community, you are uncompetitive. You will be out. You won't be able to compete with those communities who are able to get the infrastructure. You won't be able to compete economically. Businesses won't want to locate to your town, and residents will increasingly not want to live where you don't have what has come to be seen as an essential infrastructure. Think about telephone, for example. Fairly new invention at the beginning of the 1900s, and it quickly spread absolutely everywhere because it absolutely changed the game. It was so much more simple than telegraph. It could be deployed to any business that was willing to pay in order to get it, and it allowed for instantaneous communication across the globe. And there was all sorts of different uses of that infrastructure, which were readily apparent. And then there was an entire another century of new uses that were invented on top of that. We are still inventing new uses to take economic advantage of telephone systems that now span the globe in instantaneous communication. It's interesting that that telephone infrastructure is now being co-opted into the internet and making that slow transition away from actual copper wire. But the point, of course, is that if you were a community in early 1900 Canada and you didn't have access to telephone, or you couldn't offer that infrastructure to businesses in your area, you were out. You could no longer compete and attract economic activity. And increasingly, as the infrastructure developed, people didn't want to live there. If someone else builds it and you don't, you're out. Now, Canada's got some serious geography problems. We're the second largest country on Earth, and we have just under 38 million people as of 2019 clustered along the southern border, both by early design of infrastructure and by necessity. And we are a resource production and extraction economy almost by necessity as well, from the fact that we have such a huge resource base and we are still developing our resource base. And there's a hungry world out there. We produce more primary resources than we consume as a nation, and so we heavily rely on the exportation of those products. For a country like us that does resource development, infrastructure is absolutely critical. And if we want to keep up with other countries too, we have to keep up with our infrastructure. That means it's really expensive. We have far fewer taxpayers, and we have the exact same demand as countries with more taxpayers in a smaller geographical area to build and deploy infrastructure. The upshot of that is that over Canada's entire history, we haven't been able to rely on the private sector to get the job done. Understandably, it's not the job of private industries to deploy infrastructure into areas where they can't make a profit doing it. That is not what business is for, and we shouldn't expect them to do it. It's the job of the public sector to leverage their own resources and encourage the development of infrastructure, whether by doing it directly or incentivizing it, in order to maintain and increase the quality of life for citizens, driving economic growth, that sort of thing. Now, this has been the overwhelming history of our nation as well. For every major piece of infrastructure that was on the list on the last slide, Canadian governments have intervened to get the job done when the private sector doesn't get the job done. For telephone, for example, in the early days of deployment, there was like 58 different telephone companies in Canada, but they wouldn't build out into the rural areas, and they had a hard time connecting between cities. And so they started to form conglomerations of private companies to make connections between the cities. And then eventually, because the job still wasn't getting done, governments across Canada created Crown Corps in almost every single province and territory in the nation in order to complete the build out of the telephone system. Most of those Crown Corps have now dropped away at this point in time, as the network is now pretty much ubiquitous. And if you can hear my dogs barking in the background, I apologize. Yay. Now, truth bomb time. We're falling behind competitor nations because we are not deploying broadband infrastructure with public funds in a geographical situation where we need to. Private industry won't get this done for us if left to their own devices, and the benefits are worth the public investment. So we're doing pretty good in southern Alberta here. If you ask the CRTC, they would not say that we are that we're doing better than most areas of rural Alberta, most areas of rural Canada, to be honest. That's taken an awful lot of work. We've got a higher density of population than other areas of rural Canada, which helps. But we have a long way to go, and we've recognized how critical it is to deploy this infrastructure. So all of our big towns that were going to get private investment have got it. And now it's our counties and villages who are without, and the broadband digital divide is growing. This crisis has really put an exclamation point behind how important it is to have this infrastructure. So we did a project last year, which was a cost-benefit analysis of Alberta rural broadband. We wanted to ask the question, okay, what is the payback to society for doing this? We did some research review. We saw that in other jurisdictions around the world, other people had done these kind of studies, and the numbers looked really good. But nobody had done it on a provincial level in a place in Canada that would really mean something to our stakeholders. And so we hired some economists. We got some really, really good advice from some private industry folks who are leaders in broadband design, many of whom you're probably familiar with. And we did a really, really good conservative project on what the numbers would be. We didn't want anybody to criticize us for putting on rose-colored glasses. And so the two scenarios we ran are, okay, what would be the payback to society if we rebuilt every single mile of the SuperNet and extended it to every community that isn't connected in Alberta, and then ran fiber to every single premises in the entire province of Alberta? That was scenario one there. And the 20-year payback was 2.97 to 1. Now that's an absurd, ridiculous, unrealistic scenario. And the payback is already 3 to 1. And the takeaway is that every real world deployment will be a lot cheaper than that, because there's other technologies you can integrate and some of it's already done, that sort of thing. And so the payback is going to be much higher. And the second case study we ran, just for comparison and for fun, is, well, what if we just leveraged the existing SuperNet, extended it to every community that isn't included, and then ran the fiber out to every premises as well? And that was 3.27 to 1, kind of validating our assumptions that as you get closer to real world scenarios, the payback gets better. And this study, we hoped, is changing the conversation on broadband from a new expensive infrastructure we have to deploy on the public dime. Where are we going to find the money for this? It's not worth it. To, why wouldn't we do this? This is essential and the payback is worth it. And we need to figure out a way to do this, or else we're out, or else we're not doing right by our citizens and by our taxpayers and stakeholders. So we've already seen movement in our own region. One of our counties, who participated in this project and donated money to it, is doing a public-private partnership with a company, an Albertan company, to put 50-10 coverage over their entire county. Another county has just launched forward on a similar plan. And now I'm in preliminary conversations with the Blood Tribe and with 2 more counties and potentially a third on a path forward there as well. And the COVID-19 crisis obviously has derailed everything. And we're just in the steps of starting to get our conversations moving on this front again. I've got so much more to say about this, but I'll shut up and hand the mic back.
Thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate that. Just get my video going here. This has given me, obviously, hopefully everyone on the call has learned something today here. When you think about the whole utilities piece and how integral it is for all of our communities, whether you're a resident or a business or a community trying to attract investment, it's critical for that to happen. And I know a lot of people have said, Peter, you said COVID has kind of put it this side to the side a bit, but you know what? It's almost should have brought it right smack dab in the middle, because I think a lot of people are talking about how it's an essential service now for Albertans, and we need to start looking at it that way. Nancy, has there been any questions as far as on the chat box that you can?
Yeah, we do have one question so far, and I invite people to send me a note in the chat box if you have a question for any of our speakers, but this one is for Todd. Is Fortis renewable energy focus only on solar and wind, or are there others as well?
I just need to find the mute button. So we don't discriminate. Essentially, we're not the investors in the renewable marketplace. Again, we're just an enabler to allow developers to connect to our grid. And I think, you know, with the boom in the industry that we've seen over the last number of years, specifically in Alberta, having a high resource of sun and wind, it's about getting the policy right to ensure that it's economic for developers to develop in our service area. And I think we spent a lot of time just working on that over the last while, and we just don't discriminate to what type of energy that might be going forward. That helps.
Thank you. That's great. I don't see any other questions.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I don't see any other questions. I guess for Peter, I do have a quick question, is how do we galvanize, if the pandemic has really put front and center the need for broadband, how can we galvanize the powers that be to get this job done?
Well, that's a big question. There's this is a big problem in Canada because we are up against a big business lobby which does not want to see this go fully public, and that has yielded paralysis at the provincial and federal level for a variety of reasons. It's gone political. At the municipal level, we can make legitimate progress. There's the biggest thing that I've found in all the conversations I've had and all the councils I've talked to about this is that it takes courage. Now, the study we did was partially to give our councillors the courage to make the decisions that were necessary to leverage the funds to move ahead with their own projects. Because at the municipal level, the ratepayers that you answer to are your neighbors. And if you're spending what is a large chunk of money for visible returns that won't be realized for a large number of years, probably after your term in council is over, yeah, that's scary. You want to be able to show the results and the wisdom of the money you're spending within your council term. You know, people want to be thought well of. Hopefully this project gives councillors all across Alberta the courage they need to move forward with those scary decisions about spending large amounts of public money.
All right. I have another question here for Todd. What opportunities is Fortis exploring, if any, to bring broadband connectivity or fiber optics to industry?
Well, I think from exploratory perspective, we've talked to a number of developers across our communities, and we do actually offer a joint use arrangement for third parties to attach to our infrastructure. And I think it's just really been, as Peter touched on, just kind of determining those economics of making that connection to get that last mile to the home. And I mean, we're encouraged with the investment and the possibility of utilizing our system. But the reality is that if a broadband developer wants to attach to our system, they become responsible for that capital investment to improve our system to meet the need of that attachment. And so that is creating a bit of a limitation in some of the business plans, I believe, and I put that to Peter. We have open access to the system, or people have open access to the infrastructure, but it's on a user pay basis right now.
Marc, did you have something to say?
Actually, I just want to jump in. I had a question for Peter, but before I ask that question, I should probably point out to people on this call that before I entered the world that I am in now as a public utility regulator, I spent about 28 years in telecom. So I lived through the transition from your two little copper wires to your house to broadband as we know it now. I've spent a lot of my life in that world. So I was interested in something that Peter said, and it was a statement that he said he thinks broadband should become a utility. And I wondered what he meant by that and what kind of utility or delivery model he was thinking about, recognizing that it's not within my jurisdiction. It's definitely within the jurisdiction of the CRTC, but I was interested in what kind of a utility model are you thinking about when you say that broadband should become a utility?
That's a very fair question. And there are quite a few models to choose from. The general model, which I think makes the most sense, is for us to look at backhaul in Canada as public infrastructure and to move in that direction. You don't want to completely stifle a vibrant private sector if you don't have to. And you certainly want to encourage competition, which will yield better results for everybody for innovation and growth and deliverables. You look at the highway system. The highway system in Canada is a public highway system. The infrastructure is owned by the taxpayer, and any private business can do business using the highway system. And they can innovate around the fact that a highway system exists and that they can move goods and services on it. Similar, the broadband network in Canada could become a highway system for private companies to deliver goods and services on, particularly the backhaul. That's the big connections between local areas, basically. And anybody can use that backhaul in order to provide localized services. And of course, that sort of thing could be extended out into the rural areas, because private companies have very little incentive to deploy networks into rural Alberta. It's worked a few places with specific reasons why it's worked, but generally it's not really worth it. Public infrastructure extended along rural routes to be able to cover most of the industrial areas in the rural areas for primary production that would allow small providers to deliver services in those areas. It would change the game, at least for where I'm sitting, that's for sure.
So I just want to talk a little bit about that. I'm unfortunately knowledgeable in this area, and that probably makes me dangerous. But the biggest issue in my past experience with trying to bring broadband to those parts of the province or those parts of Canada that do not have a significant population density isn't the backhaul piece. That's all there. Like, most of the capacity you need to move large volumes of data from one district to the next is already there. The real cost is getting that final wire to the household. It's that last piece of the infrastructure that is usually the most expensive piece and the most difficult piece, because that's where the majority of your costs lie. All that backhaul piece, to the best of my understanding, is already pretty much in place. It's the cost of getting that, what we used to refer to as the last mile in, getting that infrastructure to your doorstep, even getting it to the curb is a very expensive exercise, and then getting it from there into the individual household. That's where the majority of the costs are. And so when I ask you about what sort of utility model are you thinking about, you need a utility model that solves the problem of how you get that last mile dealt with. So if you think about what some of the rural, what I'll call broadband success stories have been, you look at companies like ExploreNet, where they're essentially doing it wirelessly. Why? Because it's way cheaper than trying to run wire to every single location in a sparsely populated region. So that's why I'm looking for, like, what type of a utility model are you thinking about that would solve the last mile issue? Because that's where the issue really lives, as far as I know. So I'm interested in how a public utility model might actually help to solve that concern.
Those are very good points, Marc. I'll tackle a few different things real quickly. Number one, the biggest cost we're seeing right now, as you said, backhaul's built out pretty good. We just need to get affordable access to it. Right now, affordable access to backhaul for our small communities it's not there. The cost to access the SuperNet in Alberta is prohibitively high. There's been signs in the last couple of months, last few months, that's changing, that there's been enough pressure put on Bell to lower wholesale access rates, that is coming down into the range where the small providers who do mesh networks in villages and small communities like that can actually afford the rates. And maybe they do a deal with the town where the town kind of flies under the radar and helps them out to get access to their points of access. The biggest cost we're seeing right now is the middle mile, is relaying the signal out to the towers that are within range of rural areas to be able to beam the signal down. And your point about using wireless, of course, we accounted for in our study. We did FTTP for the entire province because we wanted to pick the most ridiculously expensive scenario possible to show that all other scenarios would be cheaper. And wireless really does lower your price point on that. If you can get the towers built to relay the signal, getting from the tower to the home is relatively cheap at this point, with new wireless technologies coming available. And the speeds are getting really, really, really good. They're getting on par with actually getting fiber to the premises. So the future might not even need to have fiber to the home. The technology is just going to get upgraded every 10 years, that sort of thing. As far as what a utility model would look like, frankly, I don't know. There are as many utility models as there are people who would come up with them. To be frank, I've given up pushing for a utility model myself, number one, because I'm just one guy in Southern Alberta. Number two, we've had to do workarounds. We've had to figure out other ways to get the job done, to the point now where the entire ecosystem is so complex with so many different players and so many different people in place that a utility model for rural Canada, it might not even be feasible at this point, or at least not a public-owned utility. Maybe there's a public-private partnership that could come in and start providing service in areas, but it's not early days anymore. So, good points.
All right, we do have some more questions that are coming in, but you know we have a pretty hard stop at 1 o'clock. So in tomorrow's email, there will be a link to our website, which will have the recording of the webinar. It will have the contact information of our speakers. So I invite you to reach out to the individual speakers to get your questions answered. Leanne?
Yes, and I'm just, on behalf of EDA and AUMA, I really want to thank Todd, Peter, Mark, for taking this time to educate us more on the utilities in Alberta and what's going on. I know it's always comes up as an issue. I know AUMA, you've taken a lot of time to study this issue as well. And like you said, Mark, it's so complicated. It's just like utilities 101 for dummies or something is something we need, but it automatically gets complicated. But thank you for trying to simplify some of those issues. Peter and Mark, thanks for the questions about some of the work we're doing too, to say, hey, what do you mean by this? How do we clarify it and really be successful in what we're trying to achieve? So thanks again for taking the time this week to call in. Next week, we're actually Trevor Lewington, Martin Abel, and Ben Young, 3 board members of ours. They're putting together our webinar on Alberta's agriculture future. So that will be the focus next week. You can register online. And once again, Mark, Peter, Todd, thanks so much. And have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.